Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about sleep and emotional risk in children. And the thing that I absolutely love about this topic is that we spend so much of our life sleeping, and we really know relatively little about it. So just an overview of what I'll be talking about today. So first I'll just talk a little bit about the importance of sleep for functioning, in particular for youth and for their healthy development. And then I'll talk a little bit about sleep and emotional risk in particular, and how this might relate to mental health in children. And then I'll talk about some limitations in the sleep and emotion research area, so some things that we do not know about this yet, which will lead me into some studies that I've conducted to try to capitalize on these limitations. So I'll talk about two studies in particular that I've done. And then I'll end talking a little bit about some future directions in this area that we need to accomplish. So first, I just want everyone to take a moment and think about the fact that we spend about a third of our life sleeping. So for the average person, this works out to be about 25 years total that we spend asleep. And children tend to sleep more than adults, and so if you look at the amount of time that children spend sleeping throughout their childhood, it works out to be about 40% of their life. Now, despite the amount of time that we spend sleeping, this type of research on sleep has received much less empirical or research attention than a lot of other waking behaviors that we engage in. And really most of what we know about sleep has come from just the last 25 years or so of research, mostly due to advances in technology and our ability to actually measure and look at sleep. And while we can't say that the amount of time we spend sleeping necessarily means that it's important, we do know that it seems to impact nearly every domain of our functioning. So we know from research in adults, if we deprive them of sleep, and don't let them sleep, we see a whole range of different effects in terms of their cognitive functioning, so their ability to problem solve, their ability to pay attention. It impacts their immune system, it impacts their mood and their mental health, and all types of physical issues as well, so heart health, cancer risk, and so on. And research in children has been much less overall, and most of it has been correlational, so there's not a lot of studies that have actually restricted children's sleep. But a lot of the effects that we've found tend to be pretty similar to effects in adults as well. So we see that children who sleep less tend to get sick more often, they tend to take more risks, so as a result, kids who get less sleep are more likely to end up in the hospital for things like broken bones, things of that nature. They have a harder time paying attention, so a lot of times, at least in the United States, children get misdiagnosed with ADHD, but really it's just that they're not getting enough sleep. So they're showing a lot of the same behaviors you would see in ADHD, like a lack of ability to pay attention and so on. So the obvious answer to not getting enough sleep is to simply get more sleep. But anyone who has struggled with their sleep knows that that's easier said than done. And so in the United States, the United States Center for Disease Control recently named inadequate sleep a public health epidemic because so many people are not getting enough sleep. And many American children and even more American teenagers or adolescents are not getting enough sleep. So almost 80% of adolescents are not getting enough sleep. And there's not a lot of cross-cultural research that has been done on this, but one study that compared sleep in infants and toddlers across a variety of different countries found that rates of inadequate sleep in both Thailand and in the US, as you can see from the graph on this side, tends to be pretty comparable. And there's also historical trends suggesting that this inadequate sleep is something that seems to be getting worse over time as well. And so one study looked at studies that have reported rates of sleep across years from 1905 all the way to 2008, and found that in some regions of the world, so parts of Asia, North America, and then parts of Europe, there were average declines of about 0.75 minutes every single year throughout the century. So overall this totals to be about an hour less sleep over that time period. And studies within the United States have found that since the 1990s until now, this trend seems to be most severe, most profound. So much so that they've called the current time that we're in the United States as the Great Sleep Recession. So we're losing out on all of the sleep during this time, and it seems to be getting worse. And so there's a lot of different reasons why sleep might be impacted. So there's different biological or genetic determinants that might impact our sleep. So a lot of sleep disorders tend to run in families. Things like insomnia, so having difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep or waking up too early, does have a genetic component to it. But there's a lot of contextual or environmental variables that we can think about as well. Some similar to the contextual variables that Ben talked about in terms of his research. So seeing things like family and school. So parents set rules around bedtime. So they might set more limits for their kids in terms of when they need to go to sleep. Some parents might set less limits. Things like when school starts in the morning can impact when children have to wake up and if they're getting more or less sleep. And there's also a huge impact of the sleep environment as well. So things like noise. So if you live in a busy city like Bangkok or where I live in Houston, if there's a lot of noise, it might be difficult to fall asleep. Things like temperature as well. So in warmer temperatures, it's more difficult to fall asleep and stay asleep. And then also light too. So in particular, blue light, which is the light that tends to be emitted from things like laptops or cell phones, in particular seems to impact our sleep. So there's a hormone called melatonin that gets released that makes us tired and sleepy. And when we're exposed to blue light, that hormone gets suppressed. And so if you are laying awake at night on your phone in bed, what's going to happen is it's going to be more difficult to fall asleep later on. So things like this can be impacting kids' sleep, which might be why it's getting worse, especially over the last several decades as we've had more advances in technology. And then there's also cultural influences as well. So rates of insufficient sleep in children varies across countries. So in Japan it tends to be the worst, and then it tends to be the best in countries like Australia and New Zealand and parts of Scandinavia. And these historical trends seem to be different as well across different countries. So while it's getting worse and sleep is getting worse across many different countries, it actually seems to be getting better in some areas. So again, like Australia, the UK, and then parts of Scandinavia as well. So in addition to thinking about why people aren't getting enough sleep, what my primary area is looking at how inadequate sleep is impacting children's emotional health. And so I think probably the most compelling evidence for why sleep impacts emotion is that sleep problems are present in the majority of children with anxiety and depressive disorders. Now this isn't too surprising if anyone's familiar with those disorders, because sleep problems are actually part of the diagnostic criteria for these disorders. So it makes sense that if you're diagnosed with one of these disorders, you might also have sleep problems. But research that's followed children over time has found that sleep problems actually tend to precede or come before the onset of these disorders. So for example, one study looked at sleep problems in children between the ages of 5 to 9 years old, and found that children who had persistent or ongoing sleep problems during this time were 50% of them went on to develop an anxiety disorder by young adulthood, so about half of them. Other studies have shown that sleep problems at the age of 5 predict a diagnosis of depression nearly 30 years later. So this longitudinal research is pretty compelling. And so myself and others have theorized that the reason for this link between sleep problems and psychiatric risk might be due to emotional difficulties. So sleep problems might lead to more emotional difficulties, which in turn might lead to more psychiatric risk. And so I recently empirically tested this and found that that was the case. So greater sleep problems, so greater difficulty falling asleep, greater difficulty staying asleep or waking up too early in adolescence was linked with greater difficulties regulating emotions in stressful social situations. And this in turn predicted greater likelihood of being diagnosed with either a mood or an anxiety disorder. So most of the research on sleep and emotion in particular has been conducted in adults. And the research tends to suggest that there is a strong link between these two processes. And so one study compared a whole bunch of studies using meta-analytic techniques to look at how sleep impacted mood versus other domains, and found that while sleep impacted nearly every domain of functioning, its effects on mood tended to be the most strong compared to other things like cognitive functioning and physical functioning. And then other research has looked more specifically at the types of emotional processes that might be impacted. So one seminal study that I like in particular, what they did was they had a group of adults and they sleep deprived them for 35 hours. So kept them awake for 35 hours. And then they had them look at a range of different negative emotional pictures and pictures that were relatively neutral, so not emotional, not negative or positive in any way. And then they had them sit in a brain scanner while they were looking at these pictures. And what they found was that for the group that was sleep deprived compared to a group that was allowed to sleep, they found that when they were looking at these negative emotional pictures, they saw increased activity in their amygdala, which is an area of the brain that tends to be associated with emotional reactions. They didn't find this for the neutral pictures, so this was in particular for those negative emotional pictures. And so you can see that on the graph on the left here. And this difference in the reactivity in the amygdala is 60% in magnitude, so a pretty strong difference between these two groups. And then in addition to that, they also found that the sleep-deprived group also had less activity in their prefrontal cortex, which is the area of the brain that you would typically see when people were able to regulate and control their emotional responses. So essentially, after this sleep deprivation, people were not only reacting more strongly, but they were also controlling their emotional reactions less as well. And so some pretty profound effects here. And so moving on to some of the limitations in what we know about sleep and emotion research. I think the biggest limitation is that there's really just a lack of experimental research in youth. So there's not a lot of studies that have manipulated children's sleep or changed their sleep to look at the effects afterwards. And one reason why this is important is that, in particular, late childhood and that transition to adolescence might be a possible sensitive period where sleep is necessary for healthy emotional development. One reason why is that there's just a greater drive to sleep during this age. So children and adolescents tend to sleep more than adults. And as a result, this may be more important for them during these ages. They're also, as Ben talked about, undergoing quite a lot of different physical, emotional, and social changes. So there's a lot of learning going on during this stage. And one thing that we know about sleep is that it's very important for learning. So while people are sleeping, there's a lot of changes going on in the brain. So a lot of synaptic pruning and cortical activity, which is necessary for remembering things and consolidating experiences throughout the day. So if adolescents are going through all of these new experiences and not able to learn from them in the way they need to, that might be a problem. And so one study did compare the effects of sleep loss in teenagers compared to adults, and did find that teenagers had greater emotional effects after sleep restriction compared to adults. But this is only one study that's looked at these differences. And so another limitation is that the majority of research on sleep and emotion has not really investigated the specific components of emotion that might be impacted. So the majority of research has looked at psychiatric symptoms, so things like anxiety symptoms or depressive symptoms, or just looked at non-specific indicators of emotion, and hasn't really targeted the specific components of emotion that might be most impacted by sleep. And so in particular, we can think about emotion as falling on this graph right here, where we can think about it in terms of valence, so how good or how bad do you feel, but also in terms of arousal, so how intensely are you feeling that emotion. This is also important because emotions are multifaceted, so it's not just what people say they're feeling, but it might also be how they're expressing their emotion or how they're feeling that emotion physiologically. And in terms of how sleep has been measured in children, this is also a huge limitation in the literature. And so the majority of research has focused on parents' report of sleep problems. And often they just ask one question: does your child experience sleep problems or not? Without looking at the specific types of sleep problems that children might be experiencing. And so this is a problem, one, because parents might not just be aware of what's going on while their children are sleeping, especially if their children sleep in a different room. It might not be something that they're around to see happening. And in addition, these different types of sleep problems might differentially impact emotion as well. So research coming out of my lab at the University of Houston has found that in children, difficulty falling asleep is associated with emotional difficulties, but difficulties waking up throughout the night is not associated with emotional outcomes. So that suggests that looking at specific types of sleep problems is important. And in addition, instead of thinking about just looking at reports of sleep, there are other more accurate ways to look at sleep as well. So two methods that we use to accurately measure sleep include actigraphy and then polysomnography, which I'll talk about. And so actigraphy is most usually a wristwatch that people wear. And inside the wristwatch is an accelerometer, which is similar to like what's in a cell phone or an iPhone. If you're walking, it measures your movement. And what we can use is, once people wear this watch, we have them wear it for typically about a week. And we can use reliable algorithms to determine when they're awake and when they're asleep. So the output we get from this watch looks like this over here on the graph. And so all of the black lines correspond with movement throughout the day. And we can see based on when people are not moving, we can pretty reliably predict when they're asleep. And so this allows us to accurately measure things like how much time people are sleeping, how long it takes them to fall asleep, if they're waking up throughout the night, and so on. And this tends to be more accurate than when we ask people to report on that, because it's often hard to remember. And then we can also use polysomnography as well. And so polysomnography is a different combination of physiological measures. So we use EEG, which are electrodes on the head. We also use EOG, so electrodes on the eye to measure eye movements, and then also electrodes on the face to measure facial movements as well. And this tends to be the most accurate and the most reliable way of measuring sleep. And the nice thing about polysomnography is because we're looking at brain waves, we can actually look at different types of sleep that are occurring as well. So different types of sleep stages. And so generally sleep is divided into two main types. So there's non-rapid eye movement sleep, which is further broken up into three different stages. So you have stage 1, which is the transition between wake and sleep, then stage 2, and then stage 3, which we also refer to as slow wave sleep. And this tends to be the deepest, most restorative sleep. And then we also have rapid eye movement sleep as well, which is when most dreaming activity occurs. And so using polysomnography, what we can do is determine what we call somebody's sleep architecture. And so this is essentially the amount of time they spend in different sleep stages throughout the night. And so this is a hypnogram which outlines what somebody's sleep might look like throughout the night. So you can see there's a lot of this slow wave sleep or stage 3 sleep earlier on in the night, and then more REM sleep later on in the night as well. And so one reason why looking at sleep architecture in particular is important for my research is that in adults we know that people's sleep architecture or the structure of their sleep stages tends to be highly correlated with things like depression. So less slow wave sleep throughout the night tends to be correlated with higher rates of depression in adults. And then also altered REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep as well. So people who experience more rapid eye movement sleep are more likely to be diagnosed with depression. People who go into rapid eye movement sleep earlier in the night are also more likely to be diagnosed with depression too. However, we really don't know that much about this in children. And this might be important to examine because not only do we know that children and adolescents sleep more than adults, but the structure of their sleep is also different as well. So younger ages tend to spend more time in rapid eye movement sleep, which suggests that this might be serving different functions for younger ages. Okay, so that brings me to my first study. So I was interested in thinking about how the sleep architecture or sleep neurophysiology relates to emotional experiences in youth who are at risk for emotional problems. And so in particular, I looked at this in a sample of children with anxiety disorders. And the reason why I did that, well, there's a few reasons. One is that children with anxiety disorders have high rates of sleep problems. So up to 95% of children with anxiety disorders report at least one type of sleep problem. So this is an area of concern for children with these disorders. Children with anxiety are also at high risk for emotional problems throughout their life as well. So children who are diagnosed with anxiety at an early age are at risk to suffer from different psychiatric disorders throughout the lifespan. And then another reason is that things like hypervigilance and worry just tend to be incompatible with sleep. So children with anxiety disorders who tend to worry a lot have a more difficult time falling asleep if they're laying awake at midnight, and they are experiencing high levels of physiological arousal where they're unable to sleep. And so my main aims were to look at if anxious youth experience altered sleep architecture, so different sleep architecture compared to children who are non-anxious. And then if these different sleep profiles, so differences in sleep architecture, were related to daytime symptoms in these anxious youth. And so in particular, I looked at stage 3 sleep or slow wave sleep, and then amount of rapid eye movement sleep, and then the latency to rapid eye movement sleep. So similar to the variables that seem to be important in adults. So my sample was 66 participants across 2 different sites, so one in Houston, Texas, and one in Washington, D.C. These children were between the ages of 7 and 11, and they were all pre-puberty, so before that transition to adolescence. And a little less than half the sample had generalized anxiety disorder. And some of them had different secondary disorders, but one thing that's notable about the sample is that none of them had any mood disorders, which is important because a lot of times anxiety and depression go hand in hand and they're comorbid, and so these children did not have any mood disorders. And so for the study, so children came in for an initial visit. During this time we conducted a clinical interview to determine their diagnostic status. And then children reported on their depressive symptoms, their anxiety symptoms, and then also their physiological hyperarousal as well. And then for 1 week we had children wear an actigraph to measure their sleep across the course of 1 week. And then every single night they completed phone calls and they reported on their negative affect that occurred throughout the day. So the different negative emotions that they experienced. And then following that week, either on a Friday or Saturday night on a weekend, we had them complete 1 night of polysomnography, where they slept with the electrodes on their head so we can measure their sleep stages. And from this we extracted the percentage of time that they spent in stage 3 sleep, the percentage of time they spent in rapid eye movement sleep, and then how long it took them to first go into rapid eye movement sleep throughout the night. So first, just looking at initial differences in their sleep architecture between the control group and the anxious group. We did not find any significant differences in sleep architecture. So both healthy kids and anxious kids spend about the same amount of time in each sleep stage. Looking at differences across the groups in terms of their daily symptoms, we found that the anxious group experienced greater symptoms, which you would expect compared to the control group. So they experienced greater negative affect throughout the day, greater depressive symptoms, greater anxiety symptoms, and greater physiological hyperarousal. So next we were curious to see if these patterns of sleep architecture were associated with their daytime symptoms. And so what we found was that greater slow wave sleep was related to less negative affect over the course of that week. However, this was only for the anxious sample and not for the non-anxious sample. We didn't find any associations between sleep architecture and anxiety symptoms or physiological hyperarousal. However, we did find associations between sleep architecture and depressive symptoms. So in particular, this was for rapid eye movement sleep. So we found that increased rapid eye movement sleep was related to greater depressive symptoms, but again, this was only for the anxious youth and not for the non-anxious youth. And then again, for only the anxious children, we found that having less time before you go into rapid eye movement sleep was related to greater depressive symptoms, but again, this was not for the non-anxious children. So just to summarize these findings, so we didn't find any differences in sleep architecture across these groups, and so this contrasts reliable findings in adult patients where you do find these differences between samples that have disorders versus samples that do not. And this might have something to do with some of the developmental differences we see in sleep. So one, because children do have greater rapid eye movement sleep that might possibly hide some of these effects. The other difference is just in sleep pressure overall. So children have greater sleep pressure, they have a greater drive to sleep, and that might be hiding some of these effects too. What we did find was that youth with anxiety or with generalized anxiety reported greater symptoms across all the different measures, which was not surprising. We had expected to find that. But we did find that those symptoms seemed to be conditional based on their sleep architecture profiles. So we found that relationship between slow wave sleep and negative affect. Greater slow wave sleep seemed to be protective for negative affect. And this is in line with research in adults that suggests that slow wave sleep might help reduce some of the emotional symptoms we experience after negative emotional events throughout the day. It helps sort of dissipate those negative feelings. We also found the associations between REM sleep and depressive symptoms as well. And so again, as I mentioned before, these children didn't have any mood disorders, which makes them somewhat unique. But what this might indicate is that some of these children who have anxiety, who are also experiencing these alterations in sleep architecture, might be the kids who are most at risk to go on to develop depression later on in life. And this might also have something to do with the role that we see in terms of REM sleep in particular in learning and memory. So in particular, REM sleep tends to impact emotional learning and memory and helps us process emotional events. And so this might be something that that's contributing to that as well. And so we found these effects for our anxious sample, but not for our control participants. And so this is in line with research in adults that does find differential effects for adults with a diagnosis, in particular a depression diagnosis, versus healthy participants. And so research in adults shows that people with depression, if you actually deprive them of REM sleep, so don't let them have REM sleep, they actually seem to get better. It tends to be very short-lived, but it actually tends to help. Whereas for healthy participants, if you deprive them of sleep, they tend to get worse. And so these findings suggest that we might be onto something similar in these younger samples as well. Of course, the study had a few limitations. One is that we just looked at self-reported emotional experiences and psychiatric symptoms, and we only focused on negative emotional processes. But given that we found some effects with depression, which also tends to be associated with less positive affect, there might be something there as well. And then this was also correlational too, so we didn't manipulate sleep, we just looked at how it naturally occurs. And so as a result, we can't necessarily determine if sleep is causing these emotional problems or if the reverse is happening. So thinking about these limitations, that brings me to my next study. And so my next study actually manipulated sleep to look at the impact on both positive and negative emotions in children. And so what I was mainly interested in looking at was, like I mentioned, both positive and negative emotions, to look at both self-reported affect and then also subjective reports and behavior in response to different emotional stimuli. So participants for this study were 55 children. Again, they were between the ages of 7 and 11, and they were all also prepubertal as well. One thing that's different from this sample, from the other sample, is that they had a range of emotional symptoms, but none of them met criteria for any psychiatric disorders. So we looked for kids who were at risk, but were not necessarily at the threshold that they would meet criteria for a disorder. And then all of these children were also healthy sleepers. Oops. There we go. All of these children were also healthy sleepers, so they all slept between 8 to 10 hours a night, which is about the recommended amount for a kid of that age. It didn't have any sleep disorders. They also didn't have any medical disorders that would impact sleep as well. So the structure of the assessments that these children completed, they first came in for a screening assessment where we conducted psychiatric interviews with them. And they also completed a range of different self-report questionnaires. And then we had them complete one night of baseline sleep, where they wore an actigraph watch, and then we also conducted polysomnography with them again. And then we had them complete an emotional assessment after this night. So the idea behind this was that this was a night of healthy sleep. We would look at their typical emotional reactions the next day. And then after that, they completed a week of normal sleep, so between 8 to 10 hours. And then following that, we had them complete 2 nights of sleep restriction. So the first night they slept for 7 hours, and then the second night they slept for just 6 hours. And then following those 2 nights of sleep restriction, they completed another similar emotional assessment to the first time. And so the results I'll be talking about today compare the emotional assessment after a healthy night of sleep and then after 2 nights of sleep restriction. So during the emotional assessments, we have them conduct just the baseline physiological recording. Then we have them report on their affect and anxiety. So they reported on their positive affect at the moment, their negative affect at the moment, and their anxiety symptoms at the moment. And then we have them view a series of different emotional images. So we have both positive and negative emotional images, and we have them report on how they felt when they viewed those images. And then we had them watch a series of different movie clips. So again, we had both positive and negative movie clips. And again, we had them report on their reactivity during those movie clips. And then we also recorded their facial expressions as well during those clips. And to assess their reactivity, we assessed both their valence and their arousal. So the top line of images was to assess their valence. So they would indicate on this line how positive or negative that they felt. And the bottom line indicates their arousal. So they indicated how excited or jittery or how calm or bored they felt, essentially. And then to assess facial expressions, we used a software called face reader software. And I have an example of that here. And so I'll go ahead and play this so you guys can watch how the software operates. And what you'll see is that there's a lot of different things going on. The software gives you a lot of output. So you'll be able to see the girl change her facial expression, and you'll see changes in the different output that you see. So as you can see, as she smiles, you see changes in the output on the bottom where it indicates that she feels happy. And essentially the way the software works is it highlights different muscles on the face, and based on the different combinations that are moving, it determines what facial expression is being displayed. Most of the time people code this by hand, and it takes a lot of time, so it's really nice to have the software that does it for us. Okay, so first just looking at self-reported emotion. What we found was that after sleep restriction compared to the healthy night of sleep, we found that there was less positive affect. However, we didn't find any effects for either negative affect or negative emotion or anxiety symptoms. And then looking at results for the images, so viewing the positive and negative images, we didn't find any changes in those valence ratings, so how good or bad they felt when viewing the images, and that was for both positive and negative. However, reported arousal was different for positive images, but not negative images. So when viewing positive images, kids were reporting that they were experiencing less arousal after sleep restriction compared to their healthy night of sleep. And so just to give you an idea of what this actually looked like in the lab, so this is the same girl that you saw before. So this video I'll show is her after a healthy night of sleep, reacting to both a positive and a negative image. Okay, so that's what we would consider a pretty normal reaction, so it's very clear what she's feeling in the moment. So this next video is going to be after her 2 nights of sleep restriction, viewing very similar positive and negative images. So as you can see, very little reaction whatsoever. So in terms of the movies where we actually analyze these facial expressions, you can see these results as well. So what we found was very similar to the images where when they were viewing different movie clips, there were no changes in their reports of valence, so how good or bad they felt, for both positive or negative movies. However, for the reported arousal, we did see differences, again, just for the positive movies, but not for the negative movies. So again, similar to the images, we saw that there was blunted or less arousal when watching the positive movies after sleep restriction compared to a night of healthy sleep. When we looked at their actual facial expressions using the face reader software, what we did was we extracted 2 different outcomes from the face reader software. So again, their valence and arousal to match their self-reports. And what we found was that there were no differences in their valence and their facial expressions for both positive or negative movies. However, we did find differences in terms of their arousal of their expressions. So again, this was only for positive movies and not negative movies, where there was less arousal in response to the positive movies. So just to summarize, what this study shows is that a loss of sleep in children, and one thing that's important to note is that this was really just a mild loss of sleep, so 7 hours and then 6 hours, which, if a child is up late one night because there's a family party or a sleepover, this is something that can just sort of naturally occur. We've found these effects still regardless. So you can think about what might happen if the sleep loss is occurring nearly every night over the course of years, over the course of development. These effects might be more profound, especially as kids are learning about how to control their emotions and how they should be responding in different emotional situations. And the effects that we found tended to be particular to arousal in particular, so their arousal reactions. And this seemed to be specific for positive experiences and not necessarily for negative experiences. And so the study did have some limitations, of course. One was just the validity of it, because these assessments occurred in the lab. It doesn't really give us a lot of information about what might be happening in the real world when they're experiencing emotions, for instance, with their friends or at school or in other contexts such as that. We also might have experienced some habituation effects. So since kids had already been in the lab once and they had already viewed similar stimuli, they might have just naturally experienced some reduced arousal. And then one thing that I hadn't mentioned before is that when we restricted their sleep, we had them stay up late and wake up early. And one reason why this is important is that we can't necessarily tell what type of sleep we're losing when we do that. As I mentioned before, slow wave sleep tends to occur more so in the beginning of the night, and rapid eye movement sleep tends to occur later in the night. So if we would have restricted the last few hours of sleep, we would be able to say that this might be due to less rapid eye movement sleep, but we don't necessarily know that. So just an overall summary of the effects that I've talked about today. One thing that I hope you guys take home is that across many nations across the world, people are not getting enough sleep. And this seems to be getting worse as well, especially for children and adolescents. And one reason why this is important for emotional functioning in childhood, which might have implications for their mental health. And so the studies that I talked about reviewed both kids who are at risk for emotional problems, so children with anxiety disorders, and also healthy children as well. And the different types of sleep patterns I looked at were slow wave sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and then also sleep duration as well with that sleep restriction study. And one thing that is something that deserves some further consideration is that these effects seem to be strongest for these positive emotional processes. And so thinking about what that means in our day-to-day life might be important. And I think the biggest point of this is that sleep is very modifiable. So sleep problems tend to be fairly easily treated depending on the sleep problem. And so as a result, this might be an easy factor to target when people are dealing with emotional difficulties. However, we really need more developmental research on this to better understand when is the best time to intervene and how we can best intervene. And so that brings me to some future directions, some areas that have really not been explored in the sleep and emotion research area. And a big one is thinking about emotion generation versus emotion regulation. And so a lot of the findings I talked about today have to do with emotional responses and emotional experiences that we have. However, there's a lot of different things that might occur leading up to an emotional response. So to experience an emotional response, you first have to be in some type of emotional situation. You need to attend to whatever it is in your environment that might be positive or negative. And you need to appraise or think about that thing in a way that is either positive or negative. And there's a lot of things we can do that influence this process. So there's ways that we can change what situation we put ourselves in, we can change what we pay attention to, we can change how we think about certain events, and we can actually change our reaction or our response after it occurs. However, there's really been very few studies that have looked at these different things we can do to change these emotions. emotional experiences and how sleep might impact those different types of emotion regulation strategies. And so I've touched on this a little bit with some of my own research, and so one study that I conducted looked at how sleep problems might relate to different types of emotion regulation strategies. And while we found that a lot of emotion regulation strategies are impacted, so greater sleep problems was related to less ideal emotion regulation, it didn't impact all strategies. So greater sleep problems were associated with more suppression, more rumination, less problem solving, and greater avoidance. However, it was not associated with cognitive reappraisal, which is essentially changing the way you think about a situation to make it more positive or better. A study that looked at this using a more rigorous design also found similar effects for cognitive reappraisal. So the study took 42 teenagers and had them sleep 1 week of healthy sleep for 1 week, and then randomly assigned them to either be sleep restricted, so to sleep for 4 hours, or to sleep for 9.5 hours, so sort of like a night of ideal sleep. And then had them conduct a reactivity or a reappraisal task. So they were asked to view a series of negative images and either just view those images and then report on how they felt, or they were asked to cognitively replace those images. And what we found was that children who were sleep restricted reacted more strongly to those negative images compared to the kids who had the night of healthy sleep, which you would expect. But both groups were able to cognitively reappraise, which suggests that that ability seems to be maintained even when you've lost some sleep. So I think what these two studies together suggest is that while emotion regulation is impacted, it's not that everything is impacted and everything is worse. And so we need to really investigate the specific strategies that might be most at risk. And then thinking about this in terms of development, what this means across development, there's been very, very few developmental studies that have looked at sleep and emotion. So we really need to understand how this might impact children as they're going through major life transitions. So as they're going through puberty, as they're starting secondary school, or starting any new transition like starting work, and how this might impact them during that time. And then also bidirectional influences as well. So I talked about how sleep might impact our emotional experiences, but there's some research that suggests that our emotional experiences also impact our sleep. So if you're experiencing more dysregulated emotion, it is more difficult to sleep at night. And so looking at that and how that plays out over time will be important. And then finally thinking about this in terms of different developmental contexts. So how sleep and emotion might both be impacted by different environmental factors. So things like culture, exposure to media, exposure to the blue light, and then also family influences as well. And so just a thank you to everyone who participated in the research, and then also everybody on my research team, and then all of my funding sources as well. And thank you guys for listening to me, listening to my research. I really appreciate that. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to open it up.
You know, when you hooked up the kids, you know, the first night with those EEG, the sleepnography machine, can they sleep?
That's a really good question. So the question is, when children are doing polysomnography and they're hooked up to all the equipment, if they can sleep. The short answer is not no. So there's something that's been established in the literature called like a first night effect. So when children are in the lab, it's a new environment, it's a scary environment, they're wearing all of the stuff they don't usually wear, and it impacts their sleep for sure. And that's unfortunately one thing in the study that we weren't able to control just because of resources. What we would want to do is have them come in for a night, do like a fake night essentially, and then do a real night after that. And what we found in our research is that our anxious kids have the most trouble, especially if you bring them into a hospital and they're sleeping in a hospital. It's very scary, and so they tend to be the most impacted. So in the last study I talked about, we tried to counteract that by having them wear all the equipment at home, so it was a familiar environment. I hope it helped. I don't know if it did, but yeah, it's definitely a limitation in the area that makes it really difficult to really capture what natural sleep looks like. And that's where the watches, the Actigraph watches help, because You could have people at home wearing it. It's not very invasive, and so you tend to get more naturalistic patterns. Yeah, that's a good question.
How long did you collect all the data?
How long?
Yeah.
A very long time. So I guess that's another challenge with this area is that it typically involves a lot of effort from families. So I didn't collect the data for the first study I had talked about, but the second study with the sleep restriction took about 2.5 years. It took a long time, yeah.
Or only 55 kids?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Which is why it's only 55 kids. I wish we would have had more, but.
That's so much.
Yeah.
Seems like sleeping deprivation doesn't affect much for the cognitive, but more for emotion, especially how they react or respond to positive emotion. Is that right?
That's a good question. So, in terms of how it impacts mood compared to other areas like cognitive functioning, what the research generally shows is that sleep seems to impact everything. So there was one study who had compared the effects of sleep and how it impacts mood and cognitive functioning, and then I think it was like physical performance, and they found effects for all of them. Mood tended to be the most profound, so those effects tended to be strongest. The downside of that study was that it was conducted in 1996, and there's been a lot that's been done since then. And as far as I know, nobody's compared since then to see what tends to have the strongest effects. So it does impact all of those things, but mood does seem to be what's most profoundly impacted.
Why do you think it's impact only the positive events but not the negative ones for the children?
Yeah, so that's very, very something I've thought a lot about. The short answer is I don't know. So I guess my first thought is that I don't think it's not impacting negative. I think one downside is that our sample was very small. I think if we had a larger sample, we might pick up on some of those effects. And some of our negative findings were trending, so they were close to being significant but not. And so it could just be that the effects are not as strong and negative. The other thing I've thought about, and others have talked about this as well, who have found similar findings in adults, is that if you think about emotions and how it might be necessary for for if you think about experiencing a negative emotion and how that might help you in terms of like evolutionary psychology, if there's a scary snake, you're afraid and you jump and you get away, and that saves your life. And positive emotions are beneficial for survival, but the effects of that tend to be more long-lasting. So if you have more positive emotions, you develop better social relationships. You're more likely to engage with your environment, which is helpful, but those effects tend to be more long-term. And so if you're sleep deprived and your resources are not as great, you might retain those responses that you need if you are faced with a life or death situation, like a scary snake. Whereas those positive emotions might be the first thing to go because they might not be as necessary in the moment. That's my best guess. We really just need more research to understand why, but yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah, that's how I think about positive and negative.
Yeah.
Negative help you survive.
Right.
Positive help you being happy and
Right.
related. So if anything gonna be affected first, it's gonna be something that's not so important for life.
Right.
So the negative ones contact, but the positive one cannot reduce.
Right, and it's really interesting actually because in some of the adult research they actually find a greater reactivity to negative situations, which kind of makes sense when you're sleep deprived you have slower reaction times and a lot of things are affected, like just generally you're slower, and so if you are faced with a life or death situation you need to react in a greater way to be able to respond in a way that will help you survive, so that kind of supports that as well.
And also when you use that application to detect the facial muscles, maybe you detect the smiling kind of things with more kind of muscles movement.
Yeah.
You can see it reduce easier than for the negative one that's quite close to the neutral one.
Yeah, they might look very different. Yeah, that's true.
From neutral to negative and from neutral to positive there's a big big change.
It's true, and the same is true for when people code facial expressions by hand, but same for the software, is it tends to be, it does the best job with positive because it's so easy to detect, right? If someone's smiling, you know they're happy, whereas it's not the same with negative. So I think that definitely could be playing a role there as well.
Well, you must thank the families a
Yes.
lot, because I
I know.
know that for the parents, to allow their kids to
Mhm.
to participate in it, it's not easy for them.
It's a lot, yeah. We have a sleep lab at the University of Houston, and so for these studies, children and parents came in, and they both spent the night with us overnight in, I don't want to say uncomfortable, but not the most comfortable beds. I mean, it's still like a small room, and so yeah, very grateful for all that they've done for us to help us out with our research.
What a fantastic talk today. Thank you so much, Cara and Ben, for giving us your time today for this special talk. And tomorrow at actually 6 a.m. in the morning, they have to fly out from Bangkok back home. So this is very a great pleasure for us for you to give us this opportunity to meet you two, and I'm sure this sparked a lot of research motivation for you guys to think more about how you can run series of research that keep asking and answering your interests in terms of finding what is going on in civic engagement and also in childhood and youth sleep and emotion. So this is such a wonderful time, and I hope that if you have any research question that in dealing with Southeast Asian or in particularly Thailand sample, we could it will be our great pleasure also as well to corroborate in the future. So at this moment, I would like to invite Dr. Pandrapi Sutivan, the Dean of the Faculty of Psychology, to give a token of appreciation for both of you for your time and your wonderful talk today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a nice trip home. Thank you very much.เดี๋ยวถ้าใครยังมีอะไรที่อยากจะคุยที่ดังเจน
มีค่ะเดี๋ยวหลังจากนี้จะพา I will take them a tour around July, so if any student would like to be the ambassador with me, please show up to me, and I would be would be nice to have you guys showing them around as well.
And if you have any question, we may have about 5 minutes after this, for a break. And please feel free to talk to both of them, about his marvelous research. That's very, very interesting for me. And okay, so thank you very much for coming, and please have a nice trip home.
Thank you. Yes, thank you all for
And
your
hope you
time.
come back again.
Yes.